Good afternoon. Today I'm going to tell you why the Bay of Bengal matters as a strategic space and why it's going to become a central area of strategic contest. I'm going to look at long-standing conceptions of a sharp division between South Asia on one hand and Southeast Asia on the other, with a dividing line, a very sharp dividing line down the middle of the Bay of Bengal, which effectively has divided this space into two pieces. And I'm going to explain how fundamental power shifts that are occurring in the Indo-Pacific are going to give the Bay of Bengal much greater strategic coherence and much greater strategic importance. In fact, it's going to become a key theatre for strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific. So here we have a pretty standard map of regions of Asia. Some might call these regions by slightly different names or give them slightly different boundaries, but this map is more or less repeated in governments and militaries and universities right throughout the world. In some ways I'm putting this up as a straw man, but in fact its impact is real. We need only to look at bureaucracies and universities where different departments who have responsibilities for these different regions hardly talk to each other to show how meaningful it is. People have always sought to understand the world by dividing it up into usable chunks. Our internal construction of the world around us, our subjective conception of our area of interaction, is what behavioural geographers call mental mapping. It's an individual's internal map of the known world. It's a composite of physical geography and subjective experiences. And it's often used in a very personal way in terms of an individual's neighbourhood. Where we live, we develop a picture of our neighbourhood which may or may not have a relationship to a map, but it's certainly different to a formal map. The same process applies to our idea of regions. But while conceptions of where regions begin and end are relatively subjective and transient, they can have a profound effect on strategic behaviour. In short, the idea of regions have considerable value to our understanding of the world, but we have to be very much aware that these ideas are subjective and are subject to change. And one important conception of regions in Asia, as I mentioned, is of South Asia and Southeast Asia, with this dividing line running down the middle of the Bay of Bengal. And this has had a profound effect on the strategic behaviour not only of India but of many states inside and outside the region. I won't go into the history of why this came to be, other than to note that it's a relatively recent phenomenon. 75 years ago, the names that we apply to these regions didn't really exist in popular conceptions. And up until the 1940s, all of the territories right around the Bay were closely connected in terms of politics and trade and security. The Bay of Bengal, in fact, was really considered a strategic whole. But these close connections were swept away with war and decolonisation. And this, in fact, led to a strategic fragmentation of the Bay, which ultimately caused it to essentially become a strategic backwater, at least to outsiders. And this was in fact reflected in our redrawing of our mental maps of Asia in the years after World War II. The newly independent states of the Indian subcontinent were now called South Asia, and the states on the eastern side of the Bay became what's now called Southeast Asia. And this conceptual division was cemented by the formation of ASEAN as an economic and political grouping in the 60s, and then a decade or so later the creation, very much creation, of the idea of the Asia-Pacific as a region. And this is a sort of when you think about it, it's a bit of an odd region. It stretches all the way across to the west coast of the United States, includes East Asia, Australia and Oceania, but its western border was very firmly the western border of Burma, and it went no further than that. And this is why when Asia-Pacific institutions such as APEC were established, countries like India and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka were not invited to be members. But while our perception of a Bay of Bengal as a strategic backwater, in fact one that could in fact safely be divided up on maps, might have been justified for a number of reasons in the second half of the 20th century, it makes much less sense now as the area gains in economic and strategic importance. As Robert Kaplan recently noted, the Bay of Bengal is starting to become whole again, and it's returning to the centre of history. So here's a new mental map of Asia. In my view, a map like this or similar will gradually seep into our consciousness and change our understanding of our world. At a basic level is the geographic centrality of the Bay of Bengal in the Indo-Pacific. And I don't seem to have my little laser pointer here to point at it, but you can see how the Bay of Bengal, along with the South China Sea, essentially sit close to the middle of the Indo-Pacific. In purely physical terms, it's the Maritime Connector between the... I'll point it that way, do I? Oh, probably a little bit too hard. So physically it's the Maritime Connector between the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, and we all know about the importance of the slocks that run through the Malacca Strait and across the Bay of Bengal, ultimately to the Persian Gulf and West Africa, etc., etc. And this, to a significant extent, this has been driving the jostling that we've been seeing in recent years in terms of security and defence relationships with countries like Myanmar and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. And really the events in Sri Lanka over the last couple of months has been quite a spectacular example of the outcome of that jostling in many ways. It's also caused an effective rebalancing of India's naval assets from its west coast, facing Pakistan, towards its east coast, which clearly faces the Bay of Bengal and ultimately China, and the development of various military facilities in the Andaman Islands. But I'm not going to talk about that stuff today, which most of you will more or less be familiar with. Instead, I'm going to focus on something which, in my view, is probably more important, and that's the area's growing role as the economic connector, and therefore a key interest of strategic and economic competition between East Asia and the Indian Ocean, between China and India. One key development we've seen in recent years is the relatively good economic prospects of India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and Myanmar. And these countries are growing quite significantly in their economic importance to India and the rest of the world. And to a considerable extent, the division that we saw of the Bay of Bengal reflected a division between the tiger economies on the eastern side and the developing economies on the western side, which hadn't reached that tiger status. And while these growth prospects of these countries all remain pretty fragile for various reasons, there's reasonable chances that over the next decade that these countries, some if not perhaps all of them, could reach breakout growth of the nature that we saw of the East Asian tigers decades ago. But at the same time, the region has a very low level of economic integration and a lack of infrastructure, especially transport connections within the countries, within the region, and to the outside world. And this has prompted a scramble to build new ports, roads, railways, pipelines to connect the region. And these are largely sponsored from outside the region. These projects are seen in very much strategic terms, and they've prompted real competition and rivalry among China and India and Japan and others. And the view is that these infrastructure assets have much more significance than being a mere road or a mere port. They somehow deliver control over the region or deliver political influence over the host countries. So here's a map of essentially what we were talking about yesterday, the drive to build these connections across the Bay of Bengal. China's role in this scramble has probably been the single most important factor in growing strategic competition in the region. China is currently sponsoring the development of overland connections between southern China and the Bay as part of its national bridgehead strategy of turning its landlocked southern provinces into a gateway for engagement with the Indian Ocean. And these have included land routes to Kalkpyu in Myanmar, and also plans for this BCIM corridor to Calcutta that we talked about yesterday. Beijing is also undertaking its Maritime Silk Route initiative in the Bay of Bengal, which is slightly different because it doesn't really connect with southern China, it connects with China's Pacific coast. And this envisages a series of linked ports and special economic zones across the northern Indian Ocean. And while much of the public discussion that we see focuses on the ports and the railways and the roads, actually of much greater significance is China's intention to develop distribution chains across the region which all feed back to China. So the components are manufactured in low-cost countries, particularly in the Bay of Bengal, and shipped back to China for assembly and re-export. And this is not a new idea. It's really something akin to what was called the flying geese strategy, which was talked about by Japan in the 60s and the 70s and 80s. As it saw its home production cost rise, it realized it had to successively outsource component production to countries in Southeast Asia in ways which all fed back to Japan and was ultimately intended for the benefit of the Japanese companies who were doing it. And so these production chains or value chains are the real nub of this strategic competition. It's not the ports, it's not the roads, although these are significant in themselves, but you have to see the real economic significance of these new linkages. In broader terms, all these projects can be seen as an attempt by China to break from its constraints that have kept it historically disconnected from the Indian Ocean, and through these connections, China is reaching for the Indian Ocean through the Bay of Bengal. Now, India is playing a more active role in the region. It's trying to create some connections across the region. Commentators such as Raja Mohan argue that Delhi's dithering in developing these ties and connectivity means that India is somehow losing the competition to China. I don't know about that, but I can tell you that there is considerable truth in the fact that India is widely viewed across the Bay of Bengal in states as being slow, indecisive, and, dare I say it, unstrategic. One of the most important projects being promoted by India is the Trilateral Highway project, which would connect India's northeast through Myanmar to Thailand and essentially onwards into Indochina, and that was discussed in one of the panels yesterday. To some extent, this competes. It's not really east-west, but let's call it east-west. These east-west connections compete with the north-south connections being promoted by China. But it's not about building a road. India's approach to this project is terribly unstrategic. It's not about building roads. It's about building the transit rights, the value chains that go along with these roads. And there is absolutely no evidence that this more important area is being addressed. So these problems or the many problems that India faces in developing the overland links across the Bay of Bengal is pushing it into trying to recreate maritime links across the bay. And here's a wonderful, wonderful slide which shows you the intensity of international shipping across the Indian Ocean. The yellower it is, the more frequent or the number of ships are. Can you see the big hole in the middle there? The blank hole, that's the Bay of Bengal. That's a great demonstration of how currently unused the Bay of Bengal is for significant shipping. Up until the 1940s, Calcutta was in fact the hub of a dense network of shipping right across the bay to all the territories around the bay, which particularly gave particular focus to using the rivers in the bay to ship goods up into the hinterlands. All these connections were allowed to wither away following decolonisation, and so until very recently, a container being shipped from Calcutta to Yangon went via Singapore. Can you believe it? And sometimes it even went via Mumbai. That is it shows you how much these links were allowed to die. So Delhi is trying to resurrect these links, and I suspect it'll become much more of their focus in coming years. It's simpler, it's cheaper, it's quicker ways of creating these connections across the Bay of Bengal. So Japan's also becoming a significant player in this strategic competition, and while its strategy is still evolving, it has very clearly identified the Bay of Bengal as a key growth area and as what it calls the economic connector between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, between South Asia and East Asia. And in some ways, the way Japan's plans are analogous to China's Maritime Silk Route initiative in terms of building out these production chains, these value chains that for manufacturing that feed back to Japan. So in 2014, Japan announced the Big B initiative, which is initially focused on building an economic corridor in Bangladesh, which feeds down to the ocean, allowing transport to Japan. And there are similar projects in South India. There's the Chennai Economic Corridor. There's similar projects in Myanmar and also in Sri Lanka. So I'd like to return to the Indo-Pacific. The re-emergence of the Bay of Bengal essentially reflects the same forces that are causing the Indo-Pacific to be understood as an interdependent strategic space. The Indo-Pacific is in effect a new mental map which would transcend earlier divisions between the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean, and it also reflects an expansion of the areas of strategic interest of China around this direction and India eastwards. These are the three bays of Southern Asia: South China Sea, Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Gulf, or the Arabian Sea. We all know the security issues faced in the South China Sea. We know the security issues faced in the Arabian Sea, not only in terms of piracy, but essentially as a struggle with religious extremism. In my view, the Bay of Bengal will become another area of strategic competition in a very different way from the other two, and perhaps a less militarized way, but nevertheless it will become a zone of fierce competition between India, China, and perhaps others. Now, this is not merely an academic exercise, this idea of the Bay of Bengal as a strategic space. A new mental map that recognises the strategic centrality of the Bay of Bengal can help countries such as Myanmar and Bangladesh move beyond their long-standing political and economic isolation. For India, the recognition of such a region could also potentially reduce Pakistan's role and importance in South Asia and assist it in realising India's ambitions to assume a greater security role throughout the Bay and indeed further into Southeast Asia. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.